idiosyncratic recollections that make us who we are, the collective memories that hold us in curriculum. I'm sure you've been following that in your schools. Questions have been raised. What histories should we be teaching our young people? What should be excluded? What should be included? And perhaps most importantly, who controls the narrative of what we're telling? These discussions, I think, and just how impassioned they've been, show how important history is. Our history is part of the architecture of our identity, as one commentator recently said. The stories we tell shape who we understand ourselves to be. They orient us in the present. So with that in mind, what does it mean to be proudly Presbyterian today? To be unashamedly quarried from this reformed rock. Our tradition is a deep well from which to draw, and as schools with a special Presbyterian character, I would argue perhaps the most valuable offer to our young people is our stories, our traditions, a tradition to be rooted in, to thrive in, to live and to grow in. So if we were looking over the woven tapestry of Presbyterianism in Aotearoa in New Zealand, what common threads would we find? I did a bit of research for this talk, and some of the threads I found I didn't particularly like. And I also discovered that we are a very broad and diverse tradition. So being proudly Presbyterian, I think, doesn't mean that we hide the bits we don't like. Brutally owning the ugly bits and weaving them into who we are. I've picked 3 threads that I want to dwell on. By no means an exhaustive list, but significant threads in our story that I think continue to have much to offer. So the first distinctive thread is exactly what I've been talking about and what I think David was talking about in his talk. A Presbyterian instinct to look ever again to the rock from which we've been hewn, to look to the stories of the Bible, and to allow our communal life and our imagination to be shaped by those stories. In short, we belong to a tradition deeply to reading them with a critical eye, and importantly, with allowing those stories to critically read us. Hamish talked this commitment to open the Bible in our schools that gave birth to many of our church schools in the first place. For many years in early colonial New Zealand society, there was a fierce public debate in the public square as to whether the Bible should be taught in our state schools. We've already touched on this. As early as 1877, there was a secular clause in our Education Act which banned the teaching of Bible and religious education in state schools. And around the turn of the century, despite a big push to try and reintroduce religious education, it became increasingly clear that there was a lack of political will to do so. The secular roots in our New Zealand culture grow deep and remain strong today. The fear that we might be indoctrinating our children. So in the secular age we live in, what do we do with the fact that the founders of many of our church schools believed firmly in the teaching in Presbyterian Church School Foundation, Iona College, St Cuthbert's, Columba College, Scots, St Andrews, Solway, John McGlashan, Queen Margaret were all founded in the 1910s out of this discussion of teaching the Bible in our schools. This literacy is utterly central to the formation of a mature and thoughtful faith. Without diminishing the importance of a more general religious education, and again, sorry to keep picking on you, Hamish, but you've already touched on the importance of learning about the other religions post the Christchurch shootings as a way of combating Islamophobia. Without diminishing the importance of a more general religious education, we can nonetheless maintain a confidence in introducing our young people to the stories of the Bible in acquainting them with the history of Christianity and in resourcing them to critically and engage with the biblical texts. For a couple of very good reasons. Firstly, as an historic text alone, the Bible is incredibly important for understanding where we come from and our current global culture. The rise and development of Western civilization cannot be rightly conceived without a proper understanding of the contribution of a Judeo-Christian worldview which has its roots in the Bible, our ethical assumptions, much of Western art, literature and music that has captured the Western imagination, the rise of modern science, even our linear and progressive view of time. All of these have been informed by the Bible. Even more than that, the Bible is an historic text that helps us to better understand and engage with our history here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, since colonial times, I should add. A text that helps us to better critique the mistakes of our past, to find a common language, to work towards reconciliation and healing in the present. In a recent article written by Professor Murray Ray in the Otago Daily Times, he talks about the complex history of Christianity in New Zealand, which is often messily intertwined with Māori Pakeha relations. The likes of Te Whiti o Rongomai from Parihaka, Urua Kenana from the Urewera, and other Māori prophets found in the Bible a basis for their pacifist, non-violent resistance against the Crown. And while Christianity has been used and is still used to justify colonial imperialism, many Pakeha missionaries, were some of the staunchest advocates for Māori. We can't go into the detail now, but there is much in our shared history that's cause for celebration, and there's much in our history that is cause for sorrow. And as Ray knows, truth-telling about our history, whether it's in our churches or in our schools, opens us up to the possibility of reconciliation and a future that will be better than the past. Biblical literacy, I think, is central to this task of honest truth-telling, of better enabling our young people to critically engage with our shared past and to contribute constructively to a better future. Before I move on, I want to touch on one final reason of why I think the Bible is important. Within the Christian faith, the Bible is more than merely an historic text that helps us to understand the past. It is a living devotional text through which we expect to hear the prompting of God. The Bible takes us into a story that gives voice to the breadth and depth of our human experience. The great themes of the Bible: creation, covenant, stewardship, exodus, exile, reconciliation, redemption. They are powerful narrative devices through which we can better make sense of and orient our human experience. Again, in the uncertainties of our present age, the exploration of the Bible as a devotional text is an act of looking to the rock from which we've been hewn and finding there a deep source of hope as we navigate the times. The second thread I want to pick up on is linked to the first. Presbyterian of education for flourishing, healthy human community. That's why many Presbyterian churches look like lecture theatres. Not this chapel, thankfully. Many of our Presbyterian churches look more like lecture theatres than temples. Sparsely decorated, uncomfortable pews, rigid lines facing the pulpit. These are places of learning, our architecture says. What is communicated in many Presbyterian churches is a deep instinct that goes back to the very beginnings of Reformed Christianity, all the way back to Geneva in the 1500s. Geneva in the 1500s had a very low literacy rate, I think of about 5% at the time. And the widespread ignorance was fertile breeding ground for superstition, corruption, and abuse by the Catholic Church of the day. John Calvin, along with other reformers, sought to address these injustices. How? By putting the Bible in the hands of the people, by teaching them to read, educating them, teaching them to think for themselves, to empower the people to return directly to the rock from which they've been hewn. And that emphasis on education came to Scotland through Geneva, through John Knox. Knox was a refugee in Geneva for a time, and while he was there, he was strongly influenced by Calvin and brought Calvin's ideas back to Scotland. And so in 1561, Knox and a small group of fellow clergy set out a national program for reform, including the virtuous education and godly upbringing of the youth of this realm. Knox's vision was remarkably radical for its time. He envisioned a school in every parish, and even more remarkably, he advocated free education for those who couldn't afford it. Education must not be the privilege of the elite. Such a vision led to the remarkable advances in the Scottish education system that quickly pushed it ahead of England and many European nations. Early Presbyterian settlers brought that similar vision to colonial New Zealand, and nowhere is it more evident than in Dunedin, the Edinburgh of the South, where the Presbyterian Church was involved in the establishment of New Zealand's first university, Otago, as well as Otago boys and Otago girls. The Reverend Thomas Burns of First Church was the first Chancellor of the university, and he was an outspoken advocate for universal accessible education. Admittedly, the reality in Dunedin never lived up to the vision, and yet the commitment to education is nonetheless impressive. All of this points, I think, to a tradition that is deeply invested in building communities of learning. A tradition that saw clearly the inherent value of education for a healthy, flourishing society. A tradition that was not in the business of making its youth more religious, but of empowering them to be more humane, more fully human. A tradition that sees the church integrated and deeply engaged with wider community life, its politics, its business, its academia, its culture. In short, whether in the classroom or around the communion table, we are learning what it means to be fully and wonderfully human within this world we call home. All of this suggests that a proudly Presbyterian education consists in more than preparing our young people to pass exams. It consists in more than producing high-achieving and successful students. It consists in more than equipping our young people for today's workforce. Education must consist in a deeper formation. It strikes me that many of the problems facing our world today cannot be solved with more facts, more science, and more technological innovation alone. For all the advances we have made in science and technology, superstition, intolerance, conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation are endemic in our society. We have not come so far as we might like to think from the suspicious and ignorant Geneva of Calvin's day. We are discovering in our current climate that human beings more often than not make decisions with their gut rather than their head. For instance, it's one thing to understand climate change as an abstract problem. It's another matter entirely to change our personal and communal ways of living. The latter requires a change of heart, a change of soul. Here, once more, our tradition is a deep well from which to draw. We are well placed to build communities of learning that incorporate formative and transformative practices, a broad and deep education that integrates practices of prayer, of confession, of lament, of thanksgiving, of loving service, practices that take us beyond ourselves, that give us language to negotiate the challenges of our age, and that cultivate in our young people humility, compassion, and grace. The formal theological word for this is liturgy. Expressions, movements of our common life that invite our young people into a different way of being human, that invite them to imagine new possibilities for a future that is better than the present, that gives them words and language to put around their grief, their stress, their anxiety, their sadness. It leads me to the third and final distinctive thread, the centrality of Sabbath rest. This is the shortest, and given that I'm talking about rest, if you do need to take a rest, I won't be offended. Presbyterians were well known for their Calvinist work ethic. Diligent, disciplined, frugal. Such a work ethic, coupled with a strict moral piety, gave rise to the stereotype that Presbyterians were dour, humorless, judgmental, hard-working, stick-in-the-muds, unable to enjoy life. Which is not an entirely inaccurate description. At the centre of their moral piety was the observance of the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, on which, and I quote, whistling, cooking, unnecessary travel, amusement, and any frivolity were frowned upon. Sabbath breaking was sternly denounced, at times verging on the ridiculous. Many farmers, for instance, needed to take their milk to the factory every day or else risk it spoiling. And one reporter for the Presbyterian Outlook once advised farmers to take that risk of their milk spoiling, for Sunday milk delivery is a sin on par with prostitution and the opium trade. Why have I chosen this as my final thread? Well, because the strict observance of the Sabbath was a vital antidote to the Calvinist work ethic, an intentional break in the midst of the industriousness, a whole day devoted to rest, to recreation, to learning together, to caring for the neglected. Work, yes, and rest. Life and liturgy, perspiration and prayer. Presbyterians saw the whole of life necessarily balanced between these two poles. Worship informs our work in the world and vice versa. The two deeply integrated as the whole of life is oriented in service to God. It seems to me that today we've gotten things out of balance. In short, we overwork and we overconsume. Both of these are product of an economic system dependent on economic constant growth. A system that reduces humans at times to consumers and cogs in an economic machine. And both and for our planet. Work ethic remains alive and well, but without the resting part. Our schools and universities, highly competitive environments, can actually at times embed this philosophy from an early age in our young people. Students are pressured by their peers, no less, to spend every hour studying lest they slip behind the pack, lest they don't succeed. Sleep and overwork are commonplace. We live in a society that encourages us to stretch our roots widely, but not deeply, to grow quickly, but not sustainably, to produce a bumper crop, but not to withstand the storms that come in the winter. And so we've come full circle. Sabbath practices are practices that break the busyness, that disrupt the ceaseless cycle, that provide space for the of the earth. Sabbath observance dignifies an economic machine. We're more than winners and losers. We're more than consumers. We're reminded that the goal of life is not simply to work and consume, but to live in joyous relationship with God and with one another. Really, in my means to be part of a living tradition. We find in our past the architecture of our identity now. When we look to the reformed rock from which we've been hewn, we'll see a lot that is forgettable, a lot that needs to be challenged, a lot that needs to be confronted. But we will also find rich veins that run deep into the earth, veins that continue to offer much today. I've tried to show that we're not so far from the early Presbyterians in colonial New Zealand, or from John Calvin's Geneva, or indeed from the characters we read about in the Bible. We find that their problems are not so different from our own, that we share a common humanity, that we're being invited into a shared story, pebbles hewn from the same rock, being smoothed by the common river, and being swept out eventually to the vast ocean, when God will be all in all. Thank you.
I was lucky enough to train with Jordan, 5, 6 years ago. We crossed over for a year. And when Presbyterian ministers get together, we do lots of things. We often drink whiskey. We also often lament at the state of our church. 3 weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be up at Church Marae, Hopi, with Kerry Enright, who Jordan shares the leadership of Knox Church in Dunedin with. And I asked Kerry, what's given you hope right now in our church? And without missing a beat, he said, Jordan Reading. And we can see that there's so much in what you've said today. It was so rich, and I certainly want a copy of it. And I think the topic was proudly Presbyterian, and I, for one, and I expect all of us here, and now, as a result of what you have shared, have given us hope and are making us feel very proud indeed to be Presbyterian. Thank you.
The next part of the conference is the breakout group. So, those people who are going with the board thing, you're going with Hamish, he's facilitating. If you wouldn't mind going over there, because tech crew want to do a bit of fiddling around with the cameras. The